In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how you can easily create a Codes GUI in Roblox so that players can redeem codes in your game and earn rewards. In addition to showing you how to create and script this GUI, I'm also providing some GUI assets as well, such as this GUI that you're seeing on screen, and I also go over how we actually create this GUI itself. With that being said, if you guys do enjoy the video or it does help you out, make sure you smash the like button, also hit the subscribe button, and turn post notifications on if you want to get notified when I upload more Roblox development content. And I have a Patreon. If you guys like to support me and gain access to all the scripts and the game file that I made during this video, there's a link down below the description, and you guys can check that out. With that being said, let's get right into it. Now, before we get started creating the GUI, what you guys are going to want to do is you're going to want to go down below in the description, and in the description, there's going to be a link to a Patreon post, which everybody can access for free. Now, if you go to this post and scroll down, you can see that there's actually two attachments. One is a zip file with scripts inside of it, and then the other is a zip file with images inside of it. What you're going to want to do is click on both of those and download them to your computer. Now, like I said, these assets are for completely free, and you guys can use them in your own game. You literally don't even need to create a Patreon account to access these. There's just a link down below in the description to this page. Once you've saved those two files, go ahead and locate them in the Explorer, and you should see that these are both zip files. Now, if you right click on them, you should see some options in here for extracting the files. If you don't have the extract files option, I would recommend getting WinRAR. There's also a link down below in the description for that as well. Once you have WinRAR, you can go ahead and click on extract files, and that'll create a brand new folder with another folder inside of it, but inside of that folder, there are some images right here. Now, we also want to do the same thing for the script zip as well, so we're going to extract those files. Now we have a scripts folder inside of here, and inside of the scripts folder, we have a replicated storage folder, which has a player data.rbxm file, and also we have a server script service, which is a .rbxm file as well. With these files, what we can do is we can actually open up Studio, which we can see I have Studio open right behind here. Then you should be able to drag and drop these directly into Studio, and they should create folders inside of the workspace. Now, since I dragged the server script service file into here, we actually want to put these two folders inside of the server script service. And if that's not actually working for you, I'll show you how you can do it a different way with the replicated storage. So what we're going to do is go inside of the Roblox Studio, right click on the replicated storage, click insert from file. Then in the Explorer, you're going to want to locate where your script folder is located. You're going to open that, open up the replicated storage folder, and then click on the player data.rbxm and click on open. And now we can see that there is a player data folder with a module name template inside of it right here. So now we've imported the scripts into our game. We also want to add the image files to our game as well. So we're going to go to view. We're going to open up our asset manager. Make sure that you save your game to Roblox so that you actually have an asset manager. So now that we've published our game, the asset manager looks a little bit different for us. And what we can do is we can click on bulk import. Then once again, you're going to want to locate your scripts and images folder, open up your images folder, and then you can select all three of the images that we have and click on open, and then Roblox should automatically import those right into your studio, and now we have these images right here. If you're ever having issues accessing those images, all you have to do is go inside of the asset manager, click on images, and then you should see all three of those images that we uploaded right here. The reason that we needed to upload those images is so that we could actually use them to create our GUI, and the reason that we added scripts into our game as well is because I'm giving you guys sort of a base plate for how we would actually script this system, and rather than taking time out of this video to explain to you guys how to create a player data manager using profile services and other stuff like that, we're going to save a bunch of time because I created the basic script for using profile services, adding those to your leader stats, and then other little simple things like that, so that all we have to do is focus on scripting this specific GUI. Now, if you're unfamiliar with profile services or how we're managing your data right here, I actually have a really good video on it, and I'll leave a link down below in the description, and there's a card at the top right that you guys can click, and you should probably watch at the end of this video if you're unfamiliar with how that player data works. With that being said, though, we can close all of those folders, and then we should be able to start up our game. Once we start up our game, you should see some text in the output right here talking about profile services. It might say data will not be saved, or it may also say that data will be saved. It depends on how you have your settings set up, but you should also see leader stats at the top right here as well, so that we have some money. Just for this example, we're going to be using money as the sort of stat that the player is going to get from redeeming codes in our game. That's why we have that set up as a leader stat. So if you do see a message with profile services in the output and you do see that leader stats, that means that you're on the right track and you're good to proceed. Now that we have all that stuff imported into our Roblox Studio, what we're going to start doing is working on creating the GUI. So we're going to go inside of the Star GUI and create a brand new screen GUI, and we're going to rename this to Codes. We also want to change some properties on here as well. You can ignore the GUI inset, but I'm not going to do that for right now. What I do want to do is set reset on spawn to false because we don't want the GUI to reset whenever a player respawns, and we also want to set the z-index behavior to global as well. Then what we're going to do is inside of the GUI, we'll add a brand new frame. Now, for the position of it, we most likely want it to be completely centered on the screen, so we're going to change the anchor point to 0.5, 0.5, and then for the position, the scale, we're going to set that to 0.5, 0, 0.5, 0, just like that, and now our frame is centered. For the size, we also want to use scale for this as well, and we're going to try to start off with like 0.38, 0, 0.63, 0, and see how that looks. And I think that actually looks pretty good. It's not too wide and it's not too tall, so that's pretty decent sizing. Then what we're going to do is inside of this, we're going to add a brand new image label, and we're going to rename this to background. Then for the size, we want to set the size to 1, 0, 1, 0, so that it's the full width and the height of its parent, which is this frame right here. Then for the image, what we want to do is we want to actually grab the frame background right here, copy ID to clipboard, and paste that right there. So now this image label holds that image. We also want to set the background transparency of this image label to 1, and we want to do the same for the frame background transparency as well, just like that. Next, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to add a text button to this, and we're going to rename that to exit. Then for the size, we want to make sure that it's set to scaled. So for right now, we're just going to set to like 0.1, 0, 0.1, 0. For the text, we actually don't want there to be any text displayed on it. And then all we're going to do is move it over to this X, and we basically want to resize it so that it's the same width and height and basically the same size of this X right here. You might want to make it a little bit larger. You might want to make it a little bit smaller, and it's honestly a little kind of hard to see, but I think that looks pretty good. Then what we're going to do is we're going to set the background transparency of the exit button to 1 so that we no longer see it. One more thing that we might want to do with this is we might want to actually adjust the Z index of the exit button to 2, and it might not be necessary, but we always want to make sure that the exit button has a higher Z index than the background of this image label, for example. Otherwise, if the exit button is appearing below the image label right here, then that means that the players would not be able to click on the button to exit the GUI. Next, what we'll do is we'll add a text label inside of here, and we're going to rename that to title. Then for the text, we are going to say codes. For the text color, we are going to change this to white. For the background transparency, we can set that to 1. And then for the text, we want to make sure that the text is scaled, and we're going to change the font to Fredoka 1, and we're going to set that to bold as well. Then for the sizing of this, we want to make sure that we set that to scaled. So I'm just going to do 0.1, 0, 0.1, 0, and then reposition this myself a little bit, or resize this a little bit. Then for the positioning, at least for the anchor point, we're going to set the anchor point X to 0.5, and then for the position scaled X, we want to set that to 0.5 as well so that it appears centered on the X axis. And now what we can do is kind of resize this a little bit and use that as a way to kind of move this down a little bit or center it on this specific part. And honestly, I think that looks pretty good. If you guys want the exact sizing of it, that's the exact sizing of it right there, and the exact positioning of it is right there as well. Next, what we'll do is we'll duplicate this title and rename it to subtitle, and then we also want to add a UI stroke to this as well. Now inside of the UI stroke, we're going to select on the color, then we're going to click pick screen color, and then we'll just grab the red from this image right here. So there we go, we've got that nice little red. Then what we can begin doing is moving the subtitle down a little bit. We're going to go ahead and increase the stroke, I think to like maybe 7. I think to about 7 is pretty good. We also want to modify the line join mode. I like Milter, but you could do whatever you want. The reason that I like Milter is because if you look at this O, if it's on round, which is default, the inside of the O doesn't actually have a stroke really around it, but if we use Milter, that fills the inside of the O and the D and stuff like that, and I think that looks better. So of course you can do whatever you want to, but that's why we're setting that to miter. Then what we can also do is actually modify the text. So we can say follow at monster dev for codes, exclamation mark, something like that. Then all we got to do is resize this a little bit. So we'll stretch it out like that, bring it down a little bit, and I think that actually might be good. I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, for the positioning, we want to make sure that's centered, and it pretty much is. Now it's perfect. Next, what we'll do is inside of the frame, we're going to go ahead and add an image button to this, and we're going to rename this to redeem. Now for the image property of this button, we actually want to grab the redeem button background ID, just like that, and then we want to paste that ID inside of here. Then of course for the size, we want to make sure that we adjust that to scaled. So there we go. And then we're going to go ahead and bring that down here, and now we'll just resize it a little bit. So we'll stretch it out a little bit more. So I think that's pretty good for the sizing. For the positioning, that looks good as well. We'll leave it as is, and maybe we'll adjust it again. What we want to do next is we want to actually duplicate the title text label and drag that inside of the redeem image button. Then we want to adjust the text from codes to redeem. Then what we're going to do is we're going to resize this text label just like that. Now we might not want to make it the full height of this actual button, so we don't need to, but if you guys want to, you of course can. We're going to stretch it out a little bit, and then we're basically going to center it in the middle. So we'll adjust the anchor point and the position just like that. Then of course for the image button, we want to set the background transparency to 1 so that we don't have that like weird white outline. And now we have that button set up. We could also rename this text label, but it really doesn't matter because we're not actually going to use it. What we're then going to do is we're going to add another image label to the frame, and we're going to rename this to text box background just like that. And then we want to make sure that we grab the text box background image or the ID by copying it just like that. And now let's go into images and set the image ID to that. And there we go. Now we have like a blue square. It's kind of hard to see, but that's fine. I can also exit off of the asset manager now because we're done with that. Now we want to set the scale type property of the text box background to fit so that it is no longer stretched. We also want to set the background transparency to 1 so we don't see that white background. And then for the sizing, we want to make sure that we of course set it to scaled. So we're just going to try to set the 0.1, 0.1 for right now. And there we go. Now we'll go ahead and drag it and then resize it. Now we probably want to make it the same height as this redeem button. So I think that's probably pretty good. And I think we want to make it a little bit longer as well. So I think that's probably pretty good. And now we can try to position these decently well. I don't exactly know how we want to position these. Do we want them further apart? Do we want them closer together? You can kind of figure that out for yourself. Anyways, to make this image actually fit the background, what we're going to do is we're going to change the image color to that red right there. And it does look a little bit off, but what we're then going to do is we're going to adjust the image transparency so that it's a little bit transparent. And we're going to set the transparency to 0.3. And now we're going with that image. What we then want to do is inside of the text text box background, we want to actually add a text box to that. Then what we'll do is we'll resize it. So we're just going to set to like 0.8, 0, 0.8, 0 for right now. Then of course we want to center this. So we're going to adjust the anchor point and the position as well. Then we want to adjust the background transparency to 1. For the text, we want to set the text color 3 to white, just like that. We also want to make sure that the text is scaled. For the font, we of course want to change that to Fredoka 1. And you can decide if you want to make this bold or not. I think I'm going to leave the bold off for right now. Then we can go ahead and adjust the placeholder property. So for the placeholder text, we're going to say code here. ... And we can also change the placeholder text color as well. And what we're going to do is we're going to make it slightly more gray. So I think that's pretty good. And now we can't actually see that placeholder text. So let's go ahead and actually clear this text box right there. So there we go. We can actually now see the placeholder text, and maybe we might lighten it a little bit. So I think something like that probably is pretty good. And then now that we have that, whenever we type here, this is what our code will look like when we're typing it out. And I think that actually looks pretty good. If we wanted to, we could probably adjust the subtitle a little bit if you guys wanted to come down a little bit further, or maybe we wanted to just start a little bit further down. You could do either that. I think I'm going to leave it as is for now. You could even resize this button or this text box right here as well. One of the last things that we're going to actually do is we're going to click on this frame, and now we're going to use a plugin called Auto Scale Light, which I'll leave down below in the description. We're going to click on Add Constraint, and that'll add a UI aspect ratio constraint to this frame. Realistically, if you guys don't have the plugin, you don't need to add a UI aspect ratio constraint. This is just used to make it look better on different devices. Now you might be thinking that stroke looks really weird. Unfortunately, that's how UI strokes are on Roblox. The UI strokes don't actually scale with the different devices, which is really annoying, but that's just kind of how Roblox is. I'm just showing you this view so that you can actually see how the UI aspect ratio constraint looks, and that's exactly what it does. Now, of course, without the UI aspect ratio constraint, this is what it would look like, and it looks pretty weird. So that's why we're using UI aspect ratio constraint. But like I said, it doesn't exactly matter considering this video is mostly just for learning. Anyways, we're done with that frame. What we want to do is we want to actually add one more text button, and that's going to be back to the original screen GUI, and we're going to rename this button to open. Then what we're going to do is we're of course going to readjust its size just like that, and then we can just drag this into the middle of our screen. We'll adjust the text to say codes. We'll set the text color to white. For the background color, we can go ahead and pick screen color, grab that red color. For the text, we'll set that to scaled. For the font, we'll of course set that to Fredoka, and we can set that to bold as well if we want to. Then we'll just throw a UI corner inside of here if we want to. This really doesn't matter. You guys can obviously set up the buttons however you want to, but I'm just going to quickly create one button to show you how to actually open this GUI. Anyways, now that we've created that button, we can use that to open and display this GUI. Now that we've created that screen GUI, what we can start doing is scripting it. What we're going to want to do is we're going to go inside the replicated storage and add a brand new folder inside of here, and we're going to rename this to configs. Then inside of that folder, we're going to add a brand new module script to this, and we're going to rename that module script to codes. We can also rename the module variable to codes as well. Then what we're going to do is we're going to create a variable of this module, and that's going to be called config, and that's going to be equal to a table. Now this table is going to hold all of the codes that players can redeem. So we're going to be using braces, and inside of these braces are going to be strings, and these are going to be the actual codes that players can use to redeem. For the first code, we're going to say free, and that's going to be equal to another table. Now inside of this table, there's going to be two different properties. The first property is going to be called expire, and that's going to be actually equal to a number. We're just going to set that to 999 for right now. Then the second property is going to be reward, and that's going to be equal to a number, which in our system is going to be how much money the player should be rewarded whenever they redeem this code. So if they redeem this code, they're actually going to receive 1 million money. For the expire property, like I said, this is going to be set to a specific time when the code is actually going to expire. And how we're going to be doing this is by using something called Epoch and Unix timestamps. The reason that we're going to be using this is because Roblox actually gives us access to a library called OS, and there's a function in that library called time, and whenever you use this function, it'll return how many seconds have passed since the Unix epoch under current UTC time. So basically, for example, whenever you call os.time, that will return a number, and like it says in the documentation, that number corresponds with the Unix epoch time. So using this website Epoch Converter, we can actually convert real time to a specific timestamp in the future. Once again, there's a link down below in the description to this website that you guys can use. This one right here, you can put in a specific timestamp, which if you wanted to, you could print out os.time in Roblox and then copy that and paste it right here, and it'll tell you the exact time that it was printed at. Now, if we go a little bit further down, we can actually see month, day, year, hour, min, sec, and a button that says human date to timestamp. We can say December 25th, 2022, and let's say I want this to expire at 12 a.m. I'm going to say hour 12, min 0, sec 0, and then change this from GMT to local time. Then we can click human date to timestamp, and it'll display this in our time zone. So my time zone is Eastern Standard Time. So on Sunday, December 25th, 2022 at 12 p.m., that's what this timestamp actually represents. So we can go ahead and copy this timestamp. Then back inside of Roblox Studio, we can actually set the expire property of this specific code to that timestamp right there. And that's how we're setting when the code should actually expire by. Now, let's say, for instance, that we don't want a code to expire. So let's go ahead and create a second code. So we're just going to go ahead and put a comma, then copy and paste that. And now we're going to say free 2. And we don't want this to actually expire. So we're just going to set this number to like 9999999. And now that we've set it to something like this, our time should never actually go past this amount of time. And if it does, you've probably been dead for thousands of years at this point. So it really doesn't matter if your code is expired or not. Anyways, so that's one way of how to have unlimited codes. And this is one way of setting when it should actually expire. Additionally, we can change the reward for this as well to be 1,000 coins. And now let's create one more code. And this is just going to be testing with a couple of different capital letters. And then we're going to set the expire to 1 because we want to use this code for debugging so that we can see what our GUI will display and what will happen if we try to redeem an already expired code. Let's also go ahead and change the reward of this to 500 just so it's a little bit different. And there we go. Now that we have this config file created, we can actually start scripting the GUI. So we're going to go inside of the starter player and add a brand new local script to the starter player scripts. And we're going to rename this to codes. Then inside of here, we want to get the player service. So we're going to say local players equals game get service players, just like that. Then we want to create a variable for the player themselves. So players.localPlayer. We also want to create a variable for the player's GUI. So player GUI equals player.player GUI. And now we want to actually create a variable for the GUI itself. So local GUI equals player GUI, wait for child, codes. Then we can create a variable for the frame. So frame equals GUI.frame. And now we can create a variable for the open button, which is going to be equal to GUI.open. And if you guys are confused as to where these variables are coming from, you can go inside your star GUI, open up the codes GUI, and this is where everything is actually coming from. So we can expand the frame if maybe we forgot some of the different things that we want to make variables for. Anyway, now that we have the open variable, we of course can go ahead and make the exit variable, which is going to be equal to frame.exit. And then we can create a variable for two more things. The first one's going to be called redeem, and that's going to be equal to the frame.redeem, which is an image button. And then we also need a variable for the text box, which is equal to frame.textboxBackground.textbox, just like that. Now that we have those variables, we actually have something to consider. What do we want to do if a player actually types in a code? There's a couple of different possibilities that we can think of. For instance, the code could be expired, or the player could have already redeemed the code, or the code can be completely invalid, or the player can successfully redeem the code and be rewarded with those rewards. So we have to think, how do we want to display this information to the player? Well, the way that we're actually going to do it is by setting the text of this text box right here. So if the code is invalid, we're going to display invalid right here. If it is redeemed, we want to display success right here. Or if it's already redeemed, we would want to display already redeemed right there, and so on for all the other possibilities. Now, along with setting the text, we also want to modify the text color as well. So for instance, if the code is invalid or if it's already been redeemed, we probably want the text to be red, as that signifies to the player bad or error. Alternatively, if the player successfully redeems the code, we want to set the text color to green to signal to the player that something good happened and that they've been rewarded. So we're going to go inside of our local script and we're actually going to create static variables for this. When it comes to creating static variables, the best practice is to actually have the variable name in all capital letters because we know that it does not change. So we're going to say text, and now we're going to use underscore box underscore text underscore color underscore default. And we're going to set this to color3.from RGB. And now this is actually going to be the default color of the text. So if we go inside of the text box background and then click on the text box, we can actually grab the color of the text. And it seems like by default, it's white. So we can go ahead and say 255, 255, 255. Now we have white. Then what we can do is copy and paste this variable 2 times. And we'll rename the first one to success. So text box text color success. And we want this to be a green. So we're going to go ahead and set it to something like that. And then for the third variable, we're going to rename that to fail. So text box text color fail, and we want to of course make that a red, just like that. So now that we've created those variables, we're not going to use them right away, but we will use them in the future. What we then want to do is we want to actually script opening and closing the GUI, which is really easy. So we've already created a variable for the open button. What we're going to do is we're going to say open.mouse button 1 click so that we can listen for whenever it's clicked, and then we're going to say semicolon connect, and inside of here we're going to make an anonymous function just like that. Then we're going to say frame.visible equals not frame visible. So whenever we click the open button, normally we would just want to set the visibility of the frame to true, but the way that we're going to use this open button is actually a way to open and close it. So if the frame is already visible, we want the GUI to actually close, and if it's not visible, we want it to become visible. So that's why we're setting the visibility frame to the opposite of what the visibility currently is. So if it's open, it's going to close, and if it's closed, it's going to open. Then what we can do is we can literally just copy that, paste that right below that, and then we can say exit instead of open. Then when we click the exit button, we only want the frame to become not visible. So we could say false, but if if you left it as not frame.visible, it would do the exact same thing because we literally can't even click the exit button when the frame is not visible anyway. But we're going to set it to false because that's the correct way of doing it. Now we can close that GUI, and what we actually want to do next is go inside of the replicated storage, create a brand new folder, and rename this to remotes. Inside of this folder, we want to actually add a remote function, and we want to rename that to redeem code. Now, whenever a player wants to redeem a code, we're going to communicate that to the server by using this remote function. So what we're going to do is inside of our local script, we want to go ahead and get the replicated storage service. So we're going to create a variable for it right there. Then we want to create a variable for the remotes folder. So replicated storage.remotes, and there we go. Then what we can do is we can create a brand new function, and this is going to be called redeem code. And how we want this to work is whenever we click this redeem button right here, we want to actually call that function. So we're going to use the redeem variable, which is the image button. We're going to say mouse button one click, and what we're going to do is we're going to connect that to the redeem code function just like that. Now I made a little diagram to visualize the functionality behind the code system on the client. So the way that we want this process to work is we want a player to type a code in the text box and then click on the redeem button. Whenever a player clicks on the redeem button, what we want to do is we want to first check if the code is actually valid. Now if it's not valid, then what we're going to do is we're going to notify the player in some way. If the code is valid, then what we want to do is we want to check if the code is not expired. If the code is expired, then what we're going to do is we're going to notify the player. But if the code is not expired, then what we want to do is we want to fire the remote function with the code that we put in. Then once we fire that remote function, we want to then do something based off what that remote function returns. So if the return value of the remote function was success, then we want to notify the player, or if it was not success, then we also want to notify the player as well. Now the diagram might be a little bit confusing to you right now. Hopefully it's a decent visual aid to help some people learn. I considered it might be a good idea, so we're testing it out in this video. Let me know what you guys think down below in the comment section. So inside of this redeem code function, like I said when we were going through the diagram, we want to check if the code is actually valid and if it's expired or not. Now we can actually easily do this on the client, but we're going to want to do this both on the client and on the server, because of course on the server, when a player is trying to redeem a code, we want to make sure that the code they're telling us that they want to redeem is not expired and it's a valid code as well. Now since we want to do this on both the client and the server, we don't want to write the same exact function 2 times. So what we can actually do is use a module script to share these functions with both the server and the client. And the way that we're going to do that is by going into our codes config module that we created earlier. Now inside of here, we can make some brand new functions. So underneath of the config table, we're going to say function codes.getValidCode, and that's going to accept a test code, which is of course going to be a string. And what we want to do with this function is we want to actually return a code if the code that the player gave us actually exists in our config table. So what we're going to do is we're going to loop through the config table. So we're going to say for code underscore props. Props stands for properties, and this table of the properties would actually be this argument right here. So code comma props in codes.config do. Now with my codes, I don't want them to be case sensitive. So for instance, I want a player to be able to type free in all capital letters or in all lowercase, and I want this code to still be redeemed. So I'm going to say if test code upper, and the upper method will actually make all the characters in the string to uppercase. So if test code uppercase equals code, and we'll upper that as well, then what we want to do is we want to return the code just like that. So we're going to loop through all the codes in our config, and we're going to capitalize the code from the config, and we're also going to capitalize the code that the player is trying to redeem. And if those two are equal, then we're going to return a specific code. Now, if you want them to be case sensitive, all you would do is you would say if test code equals code, then return, so without the uppers. But since we want it to be case insensitive, we're going to set them both to upper and check them that way. So now we've created that function. We also want to create one more. So we're going to say function codes dot, and this time we want to say is code expired. And again, we're going to create an argument called test code, and that's going to be equal to a string. Now, whenever we call this function, we actually want to make sure that we're getting a real code. So we're going to say local code equals codes.getValidCode, and we're going to pass through the test code. Then we're going to say if not code, then return end, because we want to stop the function right there if the code is actually invalid. Then we're going to create a variable called code props, and that's going to be equal to codes.config, and we're going to index that with a specific code. Now that we have the props, we want to also create a variable called current time, and that's going to be equal to os.time, like we mentioned earlier. Then finally, we want to return if the current time is greater than codeprops.expire. So if the current time is greater than when the code was supposed to expire, that means that this function will return true and the code has expired. Now that we've created both of those functions, we can actually use that in our local script right here, and then later we'll also use that in the server script. Now another thing that we want to do is inside of our codes local script, we want to actually require the codes module. So we're going to say local codes equals require replicated storage.configs.codes, just like that. Then inside of the redeem code function, what we want to do is we want to create a variable called code, and that's going to be equal to codes.getValidCode. And what we're going to pass through this function is actually going to be the text box textbox.text. So the text property of the text box becomes whatever the player actually types into it. So now if we don't get a code, which would mean that the code is invalid, then we want to visualize this somehow. And what we're going to do is we're going to create another function for actually visualizing this. And this function is going to be called visualize result. And that's going to accept a message, which is going to be a string, and success, which is going to be a boolean. Now we won't do anything with that for right now, but if we do not get a code, what we want to do is we want to actually call this visualize result function, and we want to pass through invalid code, and we want to pass through false as well because the code was not successfully redeemed. Then what we want to do is after we call that function, we also want to return so that the function stops right here and it doesn't go any further down. So now below this, if the code is valid, we then want to check if the code is expired. So if codes.isCodeExpired and pass through the code, then what we want to do is we want to visualize the result. This time we want to pass through expired or code expired, and we want to pass through false again because the code was not successfully redeemed, and then we want to return it right there so that this function stops running and does not continue any further down. So now that we've verified that the code does actually exist and the code is not expired, what we can then do is we can actually use the remote function that we created earlier to tell the server we want to try to redeem this code. So we're going to create a variable local result equals, and that's going to be equal to the remote.redeem code semicolon invoke server, and we're going to pass through the code just like that. Now we're actually going to set the type of the result so that we can easily keep track of the results that redeem code should be giving us. So the one result should be already redeemed. So if the player has already redeemed the code, then the server is going to tell the client the code has already been redeemed. And the other possibility is success. So if the code is successfully redeemed, then this remote function will return the word success just like that. And finally, what we want to do is we want to call visualize result. We'll pass through the result. And then for the success, we want to say if result equals success just like that. So if result equals success, then that means that this function will be passed with true. Otherwise, if it does not equal success, then that means that the player did not redeem the code, and this will return false. Now, when it comes to visualizing the actual results, like I said, what we want to do is we want to set the text in this text box, and we also want to change the color of the text as well. So what we're going to do is inside of the visualize result function, we're going to say textbox.textColor3 equals if success, then textbox color success, else textbox color fail. Just like that. So if the player successfully did redeem a code, then the color is going to be green, otherwise it'll be red. And we also want to modify the text box text as well, and we want to set that equal to the message, just like that. So for instance, if the code is not valid, the message is going to be invalid code. If it's expired, it'll be code expired, otherwise it'll be already redeemed or success. Now, although we are displaying the result, we also need to reset the text color of this as well to the default color. And we're actually going to do this by listening to the text box, and we want to listen for whenever the input began on it. So we're going to connect that to an anonymous function. And whenever the input began, what we want to do is we want to modify the text color of the text box just like that. And that's going to be equal to the text box text color default just like that. So if we want to, we can actually go into our game and test this out. So if I type out a random code and then click on redeem, the text will be changed to invalid code just like that. Otherwise, if I use a code like this that's already expired, code expired will pop up right there as well. So this is working nicely. Alternatively, if I go ahead and type a code in again, we can see that the color is changed back to white just like that. Additionally, if we click on the X right here, the GUI is no longer visible, and if we click on codes, that makes it visible and not visible as well, so that's perfect. So now what we need to do is we actually need to go ahead and start scripting this on the server. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a script inside of the server script service, and we're going to rename that to codes. Now I've also made a diagram to sort of show the flow of how our system should work on the server side. So whenever a player wants to redeem a code, a remote function is going to be fired by the player with a specific code. What we want to do is we want to check if the code is actually valid. If it's not valid, then we want to return a string that says invalid. If the code is valid, then we want to check if it's expired. If it is expired, then we want to return expired. If it's not expired, then we want to check if the player has not redeemed the code. If the player has redeemed the code, then we want to return already redeemed. But if they have not redeemed the code, then we want to reward the player. We want to make the code redeemed in the player's data, and we also want to return success as well. Now, before we actually get into scripting this on the server side, we actually need to update the player's data with these codes. So what we're going to do is we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the template. Now, inside of this module, we want to get the codes module that we created earlier. So we want to create a variable for the replicated storage. Then we want to create a variable for the codes module. So we're going to say codes equals require replicated storage.configs.codes. And because inside of the script, all we actually need is that config table, we're just going to say .config at the end of this variable. And now what we want to do is we want to create a variable, and this is going to be in all capital letters, default codes data and that's going to be equal to a table just like that. Now what we want to do is we want to use a for loop, and we're going to loop through the codes config. So we're going to say for code, comma props in codes do, and what we want to do is we want to index the default code's data with the code, and we want to set that equal to false, because by default the code should not be redeemed for the player. That's why we're setting them to false. Now to actually add this to our player data inside of the template variable below money, we want to add a new property to this called codes, and that's going to be equal to the default code's data just like that. So now we actually have the codes added to our player data. We can go ahead and close that, and now we can start working on scripting this on the server side. So inside of our server script, we want to create two variables, one for the server script service and one for the replicated storage as well. Then of course we can create our remotes variable. That's going to be equal to replicated storage.remotes. We can also create a variable for our codes config, which is going to be equal to require replicated storage.configs.codes. And then we want to create a variable for the player data module, which you guys might not be familiar with, but that's actually inside of our server script service. So we're going to say require server script service.playerdata.manager, just like that. And now that we have all those variables, we can actually get the redeem code remote function. So we're going to say remotes.redeemCode.onServerInvoke equals, and now we need to create a function to set that equal to. So we're going to say local function redeem code. That's going to accept a player, which is of course going to be a player, and a code, which is going to be a string. And now that we've created that function, we can go ahead and set the onServerInvoke equal to that function. Now inside of this function, when a player actually wants to redeem a code, similar to how we do on the client side, we want to actually get the valid code. So we're going to say local code equals, and let's actually rename our code argument right here to test code like we've had it for most of the other arguments. And what we're then going to do is we're going to say codes.getValidCode, and we're going to pass through the test code argument just like that. Then if not code, then return invalid, and just like that. So if the code is not valid, then we're going to return invalid. Then we can create a variable called isExpired, and that's going to be equal to codes.isCodeExpired, pass through the code, and then we can check if it is expired. And if it is expired, then we want to return expired and end the function right there. Now if the code is valid and it's not expired, what we then want to do is we want to check if the player has already redeemed the code. So we need to create a variable for the player's profile, and this is in combination with how our player data is set up. So the variable is going to be equal to playerData.profiles, and we're going to index that with the actual player. Now if there's no profile, then what we want to do is we want to return error and end, and realistically this should never happen for the most part, but that's why we're returning error just in case. So now that we know that we have the player's profile, what we're then going to do is we're going to create a variable called isRedeemed, and that's going to be equal to the profile.data.codes, and then we want to index that with the specific code just like that. And now that we have that variable, we can say if is redeemed, then what we want to do is we want to return already redeemed just like that. So now we've accounted for if the code's invalid, if it's expired, or if the player already has redeemed it. And if all of those are good to go, then what we want to do is we want to actually reward the player and redeem the code. So to redeem the actual code in the player's data, we're going to say profile.data.codes, index that with a specific code, and we're going to set that equal to true just like that. Then inside of the player data folder, inside of this manager script right here, I actually have a function called adjust money, and this is how players are rewarded money in our game currently. So it updates the player's data and their leader stats as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to say player data.adjust money, pass through the player, and pass through the rewards. And we can create a variable for the reward, so we can say local reward equals codes.config, index that with the actual code, and then say expire. And now this variable is going to be equal to a number, which is how much money the player should be rewarded whenever they redeem the code. So we can go ahead and put that variable right there in the adjust money function. And finally, what we want to do last is we want to return success, so that we return this string through the remote function, and then on the client side we can visualize the success result just like that. So now we can actually test this out by going into our game. Now if we open up our codes module, we can see that we actually have 3 codes currently. Let's go ahead and test the testing code right here. So we can go ahead and paste that code directly into here, click redeem, and we can see code expired. Let's also type this a different way, so we'll do capital S and lowercase t just like that, and we can see code is still expired, but it is recognized, so that means that it is case insensitive, which is what we wanted. We can also go ahead and test out this free code right here. So let's go ahead and say free, and let's just do that in all capital letters just like that. Click on redeem, and now when we click on redeem, we can see that the text box now displays success, and we can also see that we have 1 M in our money up here. Now let's go ahead and actually type that code again, click redeem, and we can see we now have already redeemed returned to us, which means that our system is actually working perfectly. Let's also go ahead and try to redeem free 2, and we can see that that is successfully redeemed as well. And if we try to redeem it again, it is already redeemed, so the player can only redeem the code 1 time. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, with that being said, we now have a working Codes GUI in our game. As always, if you guys did enjoy, make sure you smash the like button, also the subscribe button, and turn post notifications on if you want to get notified when I upload more Roblox development content. Of course, I have a Patreon. If you guys like to support me and gain access to all the scripts and the game file that I made during this video, there's a link down below the description, and you guys are going to check that out. With that being said, I'll see you guys in the next video.